Hi, I'm Bree Stock, Master of Wine. Sparkling wine is really like learning another language of wine. There are so many different styles of sparkling wine, and it really makes it such a, fun new category. Well, not a new category because sparkling wine is some of the oldest wine on the planet. That happens very naturally. But there's so many different types of sparkling wines, everything from carbonated wine that you'll often find in cans, has more of a bubble and bead and effervescence that seems a little bit more like soda pop or, those Pepsi and Coke and those kind of flavors, or bubbles. The complexity of high quality sparkling wine is really where pet nat and method ancestral and traditional method sparkling wines really take on a lot more complexity and seriousness, and can really be just such a fantastic extension and new style and new flavor profile for a region and its great varieties. So whether you're talking about Cava or French Accorda or Champagne or Cremant or any traditional method sparkling wine, that's where you're really getting those additional complex flavors and where you can bring in more complexity depending on how long you're leaving the wine to age on terroir or on its lees and develop that autolytic, toasty, bready, savory characteristics happening in the bottle. And then, whether you release on disgorgement or are further aging the wine post disgorgement. So whether you're adding a dosage once you've, removed the wine from its lees, you can add, more or less sugar. You can leave it as brut naturel, brut nature. So there's a lot of options that you have for sparkling wine, and it makes it just a really fun, complex category. Obviously, people love things with bubbles. Terroir and sparkling wine, that's a really interesting question because a lot of sparkling wine, you would say, is more about the method. And so that aging and complexity coming from the time on lees. However, what you're getting on the palate to begin with really comes from the terroir. And so in Champagne, where you have a region that's very much on those chalky, austere soils that give very severe acidity and very strong lines of acid and minerality. That's where you're really feeling some of that terroir come through in Champagne, and also where Champagne really benefits from having some additional time on lees to build out the mid palate and give that wine some flesh. Whereas there's regions like the Willamette Valley that are, basalt and volcanic soils for sparkling wine. And the basalt soils, I find, give more saltiness to wines in general. And so I think on the sparkling wines, the terroir comes through in that profile from being a little more salty, a little more savory. And then, of course, you get down to the UV exposure and then the natural, I guess, the hand of, terroir, whether you're allowing grapes to be open to the UV and to the sunlight, or protecting them so that their skins don't get too thick and get bitter flavors developing in the fruit. So terroir really comes from both the soil, but also from the human practices that are the cultural terroir of a place that comes into the style of the wine being made. Sustainability is important in sparkling wine as much as it's important in traditional table wine or still wines. It can be more important in sparkling wine if you're trying not to add additional yeasts, which is generally what happens when you're doing a traditional method sparkling wine, because you're adding a second fermentation in bottle. So you've already fermented the wine to a low level of alcohol, maybe 10% alcohol, and it's dry. And then you're adding more sugar and yeast to have the wine go through a secondary fermentation in bottle or in tank. And so if you have reserved some of your original wine in a juice phase, you can add that as the second fermentation and not require the addition of yeast or yeast nutrients at that point. And so I think sustainability is important for those factors in the fermentation process. But again, sustainability in sparkling wine is just as important as it is in any other wine, because it comes down to the health of the vine and the vineyard and the soil and the people who work with it and in the vineyard. So Champagne, the name Champagne is a protected name, which is why you won't see champagne coming from South Africa or California or Australia. Champagne can only be from the Champagne region in France. What we're referring to when we call everything champagne is we're referring more to the process, which is the traditional method process of a secondary fermentation in bottle, which captures the CO2 and allows for the additional aging entourage or on the yeast lees of that secondary fermentation. And so the champagne style or traditional method style is where you're getting the biscuity, nutty, bready complexity developing in the bottle and in that style of wine. And there are several regions within France that make wine in that traditional method as well and can't be called champagne. And instead, they're usually called Cremant. And Cremant is a secondary fermentation in bottle and then generally aged on its lees for 9 months, whereas champagne, because of the Champagne appellation laws, are aged in bottle on its lees for a minimum of 15 to 18 months for non-vintage champagne and a minimum of 3 years for vintage champagne. It's kind of scary, the amount of ingredients that can be added to wine. Like, there can be as many ingredients in wine as in a Hungry Man TV dinner. And so, yeah, but you don't have to put it on the label because it's not considered a food product. And so that's why at limited edition, I put ingredients on the label just to kind of get people thinking that way. And then also some of these ingredients that we use as like fining agents are actually microplastics. And so we're banning all of these water bottles and, other takeout containers and things like that, because all of these microplastics end up in our waterways and in our bodies. But it's like, well, they're also used in wine as well. And so if you're generally, drinking wine that's of a certain price point, you will probably be having a lot more nasty additions in your wines. And so, yeah, it's such a disconnect between, a lot of people who drink wine just think that wine is a natural product. And unfortunately, some of those really big companies, are really processing those wines a lot like processed food. And so I think that overall there just needs to be a lot more transparency. And then I think there'd be a lot more education. And I think we would also then have the ability to, be really able to stand behind our products and say, this is why these wines and these products cost more, because they're not manipulated, and there is so much attention and care being put into these wines, and they are actually good for you. You know, they don't have additives, and they are able to be, you know, not completely killing your gut health and, you know, adding other things to your body. So yeah.